Well, welcome to installment 4 of Headfirst JavaScript Programming Teasers. In this installment, we're going to start to dive into JavaScript. And so a lot of people say that if you know 2 languages, the third one gets a lot easier. And that seems to be true both with spoken languages, but also with programming languages. And if you've had a couple of programming languages under your belt at this point, then learning JavaScript, the language, shouldn't be that bad. But we're assuming in this series that you're starting from the beginning, or you've seen a little bit of scripting. And so most likely the 2 languages you've seen aren't so much programming languages, but they're HTML and CSS. And so let's start by just taking a look at HTML and CSS, which, as you know, are very different languages. And let's compare those a bit with JavaScript. And let's just see what kind of language JavaScript feels like. Now let's start with HTML. And so HTML obviously stands for Hypertext Markup Language. We all know that, but it's really the markup in that acronym that matters. And so if we look at the language itself, what it's really doing is it's taking your content and it's marking it up to provide structure and semantics. So in this little example we have here, the H1 markup is saying that Mocha Cafe Latte is actually a type of heading. And the P markup here is saying that our little paragraph here is actually a paragraph. It even goes further with the H1 being in a class of drink, which we can use to do things like style with CSS. HTML really has this feel of we take our content and we just put this markup around it to provide some structure and to dictate what things are semantically in the page. Now let's compare that to CSS. Now with CSS, we have a language that has a very different feel. In fact, I'd call it almost a declarative feel, because what we're doing is we're selecting parts of the HTML page itself, and we're declaring what the style should be for that page. For instance, we could say that every H1 which belongs to the drink class should be colored brown, or every paragraph should have the sans serif font. So what we end up with CSS is a set of rules that are basically declaring style for what's in your CSS page. Now, you should notice that HTML and CSS look really different. And the reason is because they have very different jobs. Again, HTML is for creating the structure and semantics of your page, and CSS is for adding the style. So what about JavaScript? We've seen a language that is for marking up structure, and we've seen a language that is for adding style on top of that structure. So what does JavaScript look like? Well, the thing to remember about JavaScript is it's a language for describing behavior. In other words, it's a computational language. It's a language for describing how things get done. And if we look at a little snippet of JavaScript, we see it has lots of statements in it, one after the other, each one furthering the computation a little. We might see statements that declare variables that we can use later and store things like numbers or character strings. We might see statements that are making decisions, such as if the age of the user is greater than 14, then do something, otherwise do something else. And as we'll see, there's a bunch of other things that we can do as well. But JavaScript looks like a set of statements. So let's now take an even closer look at what JavaScript looks like. All right, so we're going to do a little detective work here. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the Starbuzz coffee page. And you might notice this page from the Headfirst HTML book. Now what happens when I load this particular page is it makes a suggestion in a little dialog box for a Mocha Cafe Latte. However, if I refresh again, I get a different suggestion, and that's for the house blend. And so how is this working? Well, let's take a look at the source for this page. And we'll see in that source that we've got some JavaScript. So let's step through that JavaScript and figure out how we're getting different suggestions when we reload the page. So before we get started, let me just zoom in on this code. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to step through each line of this code to see what it does. And our goal here is just to get a feel for JavaScript right now. We're not trying to understand every little detail and nuance. Let's just get a feel for how this works. So let's start at the top. The first thing we're doing in this code is we're creating 2 variables. And variables are a way in JavaScript of storing values that we're going to use later. First, we declare a variable called suggestion, and we're actually not assigning that to any value at this point. We're just making the variable for later use. Next, we're creating a variable called choice, and we're actually assigning that to a value. And that value is this slightly complicated looking expression to the right of the equal sign, the math.floor math.random times 4. Now, what you need to know about this right now is math.floor and math.random are two functions that come from a library that's supplied by JavaScript. It's a library of math functions. And the end result of this expression is to create a random number between 0 and 3. And that gets assigned to choice. And every time we reload the page, this code gets rerun and we'll get a new random number. So right now in this code, we have a variable suggestion that's undefined, and we have a variable choice, which holds some number between 0 and 3. Now, another thing we can do in JavaScript is we can make decisions, and a lot of times those decisions are based on the value of a variable. If we look at this if statement here, we're saying if the value of our choice variable happens to be 0, and remember it can be 0, 1, 2, or 3, then we're going to set that variable suggestion to house blend. Otherwise, using the else statement here, we're going to set that suggestion to mocha cafe latte. If you think through the logic of this, if choice can be the value 0, 1, 2, or 3, then about 25% of the time that we hit this page, suggestion should get set to house blend, and the other 3/4 of the time, it'll get set to mocha cafe latte. All right, so we're almost there. We've only got 2 more statements, and at this point, choice is set to some number between 0 and 3, and suggestion has our coffee suggestion. Now here, we're creating another variable called message, and presumably this is the message that is going to get given to the user. And what we're doing is we're taking a string, may we suggest, and we're essentially adding that to the suggestion, and then adding on the end of that the word today. And this is known as string concatenation. And so what we're doing is we're building up a string by adding together strings. And what we end up with is a string like, may we suggest a house blend today. Once we have that, then we get to our last statement, which is another one of these function calls. It's a built-in function called alert. And what we do is we give alert that message, and then alert displays the dialog box with our message in it. So essentially, all this code really does is it randomly chooses between house blend and mocha cafe latte. It creates a little message for the user, and then it uses the built-in function alert to give that message to the user in a little dialog box. Now, clearly we've only scratched the surface here, but what we've really tried to get across is just the flavor of JavaScript as a sequence of computational steps that we use to create behavior. Now, we can take those steps and we can group them and we can abstract them and we can do all kinds of interesting things with these steps. And we'll be getting into all that. But hopefully, in this installment, you've gotten a flavor for JavaScript.
That's all for this installment, but you can find out a lot more about JavaScript by joining us as we write headfirst JavaScript programming. Just point your browser to wickedlysmart.com/JS signup, and we'll see you in the next installment of Headfirst JavaScript Programming Teasers.